right, so where are we at today? So today we're starting Module 8. Module 8 will cover the control of microbial growth through disinfectants, antiseptics, that type of thing. So usually, for the most part, this chapter is more focusing on control on inanimate objects. Okay, there is some crossover for living tissue, but in general, it's inanimate objects that is the focus, which would be those fomites. And then this unit will then also move into Module 9, which will cover the microbial control of microbial growth inside the body or on the surface of the body through antibiotics. And then Module 8 will be looking at the disease progression, how the organism establishes the disease, and then the epidemiology, so the study of the disease transmission and how we can slow it down or stop it. Okay, so those are the areas that we're looking at for this particular unit. All right, so for Module 8, what? It's not liking me here. Here we go. No, did it? Still not liking me. There we go. So we're, the learning modules that they had set up for this particular is actually pretty short. However, probably the biggest one that holds a lot of information is actually 18.3. So we have, first of all, we're going to learn about the basic terminology for controlling microbial growth. And then we'll move into factors that influence these antimicrobials, followed by we're going to classify both physical and chemical means of microbial control. And then we will have application as far as how do we demonstrate that it's working, what are the laboratory tests that we might perform for these particular antimicrobials to show their efficiency. So to start off with, of course, we're going to talk about, what exactly is death for microorganisms. And for a multicellular organism like ourselves, death is probably a lot easier to identify, right? How do we know somebody is dead? They're not breathing. That's one. What else? There's no heart rate, right? No brain activity. There's very easily identified items that one could say, okay, this organism is no longer alive, right? But when we are talking about a single-celled organism, death isn't as clear and isn't as clear-cut. Really, a cell is considered dead once it has obtained enough irrevocable damage that is no longer able to reproduce. Okay? So, it could still be metabolizing, it could still be having functions that for the cell, and yet the cell is officially dead because the whole purpose of a single-celled organism would be to metabolize and reproduce, right? If it's not able to reproduce, that's it. When we look at microbial populations and we are observing microbial growth, when we're looking and so therefore identifying microbial death, we start looking at this what we call this a D value, okay, or which is also a decimal reduction time, okay, and that reduction in a population of, so in a culture tube, right, is going to be declining at a constant rate, okay, where 90% of the population, for every, period of time, 90% of the population declines, right? So that indicates that our population is going into, death is happening to this population. So then it's just a matter of identifying with this constant decline rate, right? And this is on the log scale, but with this constant decline rate, how long is it going to take before that culture crashes and is completely dead? Okay? So they use this microbial death rate to then actually look at the efficiency of a particular antimicrobial agent. So there are, of course, terms. If we're looking at microbial death, we're looking at antimicrobials that are microbiocidal. So these are suffixes. We have cidal and stat, or static. Okay, so if it's microbiocidal, then we're looking at an antimicrobial that is going to kill the population. If it is just inhibiting the growth, then we refer to it as microstatic. Okay, microbiostatic. Now, the term before that suffix just refers to what we're talking about. If it's microbiological in general, right? Then it's microbiocidal, right? Or if we're talking about specifically bacterial cells, it's bactericidal, or fungal cells, fungicidal, right? So the term in front of it indicates what we're talking about. Virucidal would be when we're talking about death of or destruction of the virus, because viruses you can't kill a virus, right? You inactivate it, you can't kill it. So antimicrobials can work in either means, depending upon the specific antimicrobial that we're talking about, as well as different factors may come into play as to whether it is going to fall under the classification of cidal versus static. Okay, factors that can contribute to this would be, number one, the organism that's being targeted. Are we talking about vegetative cells? Are we talking about fungal cells? Or are we talking about endospores, bacterial cells? You know, what are we looking at that we're trying to target with this antimicrobial? The concentration, okay, of the particular antimicrobial that you're using. Sometimes the concentration is higher concentrations are more bactericidal, maybe, and then the lower concentrations are maybe more bacteriostatic. Again, depends upon the particular chemical, and also then how it is applied, okay, and to what surfaces, what type of exposure time, that type of thing can come into play. Now, as far as terminology. They have a nice little chart. This is pulled directly from the online text, so you know it's right there available to you online. And the terminology we want to get familiar with, of course, would be the term disinfection. We have sterilization, sanitization, antisepsis, and degerming. Those are the main terms that we look at. Now, sterilization, I'll start with that. That's the most severe form of microbial control, because sterilization means that you are killing all vegetative cells, spores, viruses, basically anything living, and deactivating any virus that's out there. Okay? Sterilization processes tend to be a harsher treatment process. So we do not use, they're not practical for living tissue, obviously. Mostly for sterilization, we are looking at specific heat treatments, okay? And then there are a few chemical sterilants that exist, okay, that we'll touch upon those. More commonly, sterilization is a term that is misused quite frequently, okay? And I won't lie, I'm prone to it too, right? It's just throwing out, well, we're just going to sterilize this. You know, we're not sterilizing many times. Many times it's not sterilization, but rather disinfection that we're doing. Disinfection is a less harsh treatment, and it is going to be a process that destroys your vegetative cells. Okay, it'll remove most of your toxins, but is not always going to deactivate your viruses. Is not generally going to destroy your endospores. Those more resistant forms, life forms for that some bacteria have. Okay. Again, though, disinfection, if you're using disinfection product, again, it's usually at the concentrations are such that it's not ideal for living tissue, okay? Thus, when you go into the store and you pick up your disinfectants, though not all of us, me included, wear gloves when it says that you should be wearing gloves, right? Most of your disinfectants will tell you you're supposed to wear gloves while using them, okay? Because it's not meant to come directly in contact with the skin. This can include, so disinfectants can include things such as 5% bleach. Boiling is actually a disinfection process, not a sterilization process. UV light is considered a disinfection process, okay? So those are, terminology as far as what we would generally use on inanimate objects. Okay, so the sterilization and disinfection. We use those on inanimate objects, oftentimes referred to as, if they're inanimate objects that many people come into contact on a regular basis, they're referred to as fomites. Okay, so the fomites are the things that, doorknobs, tabletops, multiple people, your phones, the silverware, plates, a glass or a pitcher that you might be eating from, or using say if you go to sit down at a table with the family. These are referred to as fomites because of the fact that multiple people are going to be coming into contact. Toilet seats, faucet handles, so forth. Okay. Now, in that realm, and again, in general, we're usually dealing with disinfection. Now, on occasion, we'll go through what we call a sanitization process. And the sanitization process is where we are it's a type of disinfection process that meets a specific criteria established by some sort of regulatory agency. Okay? In this case, we have a regulatory agency that's coming in saying you must meet a certain level. So when you go into a restaurant and when they take the silverware and dishes and run them through a steam cleaner, right? So it's using water and steam to clean off the plates and silverware. The heat, the level of or temperature of that water and it provides then the requirements necessary to remove most microorganisms that meet that level of that regulatory requirement. Okay, the drinking water, for instance, my daytime job with drinking water. It is regulated by public health, and therefore, we have to. It is treated in such a way. It's a disinfection process that meets the sanitization levels because it's regulated by the public health regulations. Okay. Now, we're not always trying to control microorganisms on inanimate objects. Sometimes we want to control microorganisms on living tissue. That's when we start looking at antisepsis. Where we're working with the antiseptics. Antiseptics kill microorganisms on living tissue. They include things such as iodine solutions, hydrogen peroxide, some of your alcohols, right? And so these are generally chemical-based, not physical-based, but rather chemical-based, that is going to destroy those vegetative cells. Doesn't necessarily always take care of all your endospores, though. So it usually doesn't reach the high level removal that we see with some of your sterilization and even sometimes even your disinfection products. And then the last term is one we can use on living tissue, or we can use for other products like your laundry when you're washing your clothes, and that is a degerming process. The degerming process is actually a mechanical process more than anything else. We might use a chemical involved in that process, such as the soaps, but the soaps don't destroy the microorganisms. What they do is they remove dirt and oils, and through a mechanical process, and in that mechanical process with the removal of the dirt and oils, you are also removing the microorganisms. Okay, so it is a kind of a separate process as compared to, say, antisepsis or disinfection or sterilization. All right. Now we'll bring into, what levels, we're going to be talking about what might affect then our microbial control process. But before we do, we have to look at, what level of microbial control do we actually need if we are, say, working with these organisms in a laboratory setting. So this we've actually discussed a little bit at the beginning of the lab itself, the biosafety levels. The biosafety levels are where they have ranked the different microorganisms for when you are working in a laboratory environment. They've ranked these different microorganisms into different levels, and based upon what level it falls into, we'll tell you your risk level, as well as what sort of both physical controls must be in place, so the environmental controls that must be in place, as well as what sort of PPE is going to be required, and processes that you're going to be expected to use while working with these organisms to limit your exposure, as well as to keep the organism contained within that environmental setting, within that, which is the laboratory setting, is the environmental setting that we're talking about. So it's specifically designed for the laboratory setting specifically, and our ranks start with the lowest rank, biosafety level 1, being the lowest risk, moving up to biosafety level 4, which would be your higher risk. Okay, and I've already, for the lab, already talked about the fact that in our laboratory setting, we are dealing with just biosafety level 1 and 2. Okay. 3 and 4 are worked within the laboratory setting, absolutely, but not at our level. Some schools do have it, yes, but you have to have additional physical, environmental controls in place that we do not. Okay, so biosafety level 1, we talked about how the fact that it's not known to cause disease in healthy adults. Right, so if there's minimal risk, and you need to make sure you're wearing your, your lab coat, your safety glasses. Level 1 doesn't necessarily even require gloves, but is suggested. Again, just more for additional protection. But prior to leaving the laboratory environment, you would have to wash your hands, regardless of whether you wear gloves or not. Right, you disinfect the tabletops before working with the organism and after working with the organism. As you move into biosafety level 2, these are organisms that are associated with disease, but the severity of that disease is not as severe as what we'd expect for those that fall under 3 and 4. And in this case, then we have additional controls put into place, such as the pressurized room in order to contain the air, right? So in case anything becomes aerosolized, it's going to stay in the room and go out of the room through a specific route that's going to allow it to go through filters to remove any potential aerosoled bacteria that might have gotten, any organisms that might have been aerosolized during the process of working with it in the laboratory. Biosafety level 3, now we're looking at the organisms that are going to cause more serious or potential lethal diseases. In this case, you're going to start working in a biosafety cabinet. And we'll talk about that actually in this module with the biosafety cabinets. You've got UV light that prior to use and right after you're exposing that biosafety cabinet with UV light to disinfect the workspace and the air in the workspace, and then any air being drawn in and any air leaving is both coming in and before leaving, that air is going through HEPA filters to remove any bacteria. So again, to contain any organisms in that biosafety cabinet, right? And then when you move up to biosafety level 4, these are your much more dangerous, exotic microorganisms that result in disease and that are more frequently going to be fatal in nature. And in that case, what we see in this picture on the right-hand side is the additional steps that one would have to take if working with a biosafety level 4, and that is the individual themselves is contained, separate, completely isolated, contained, and separate from the laboratory environment. They might be in the laboratory, but the suit and the supplied air that to them is keeping them separate from the laboratory. Okay, and the air in the laboratory. They are also working in a biosafety cabinet too. So as you move up in these biosafety levels, you always just add to. You never take away a PPE or a protective, environmental protective process. You just continually add to it. In this case, these individuals then, before being able to remove the containment suit that they have to wear that has supplied oxygen for them, they have to go into a decontamination room where they would be decontaminated first before removal. Again, just to make sure that they're protecting themselves, keeping the microorganism contained within the room and the decontamination room, but not coming into contact directly with the organism themselves. Okay. Now, these different antimicrobials are going to work in different ways. They have what we call mode of action. This is how they are going to affect the microorganism. And that can vary depending upon the particular either physical or chemical antimicrobial process. One is that they might alter the cell wall structure, right? That's going to be important because if you change the cell wall structure, that is remove the cell wall, then that particular microorganism becomes susceptible to osmotic pressure. So usually this is a bacterial static process. It doesn't usually, the fact that the antimicrobial is altering the cell wall in itself is not going to kill the cell, but rather osmotic pressure would kill the cell, right? So it might inhibit its growth, slow down its growth, but not necessarily kill unless the osmotic pressure that in the environment that they live in results in then uptake of water and then the cell bursts open, right? Because that's the whole function of that cell wall is to maintain the cell membrane structure and keep it, provide it support should you be in an environment in a hypotonic environment and water's rushing into the cell cannot expand past that cell wall. But now, if you use an antimicrobial that has removed the cell wall or disrupted it enough to compromise it enough, then the cell could burst. Okay. Another means would be disrupting the membrane itself, right? Or changing the membrane's permeability. The cell membrane is what defines what's in the cell and what's outside the cell. So by compromising the cell membrane, you now are going to, place this cell in a compromised state. Basically, once the cell is compromised, the cytoplasm can leak out of the cell. You no longer have that definition. The cell then lyses. Okay, so that's another way in which the antimicrobial might work upon the particular microorganism. Now, for a virus disrupting a membrane, if it's able to disrupt a membrane of a bacterial cell, then it could very well disrupt the envelope, the viral envelope of the viruses, right? And therefore make them deactivate them, right? Because that's it is on for those viruses. I want to say organisms. Those viruses that have an envelope, the proteins that allow them to recognize the next host cell are on the envelope. Remove that envelope, okay? Then you've deactivated. Damaging protein and nucleic acids. That can occur through denaturation, degradation, or chemical modification, right? So, a mutagen comes in and interacts with the nucleic acids, and that results in damage. Something as simple as heat is going to denature, right, proteins. Well, it's also going to denature nucleic acids. Denaturation is applicable for both of those macromolecules. Okay, but denatured, either of those macromolecules being denatured results in, say, a protein. It results in protein function. And nucleic acids, that results in the inability for that cell to maintain its genetic information. Okay. All right. And then interrupting metabolism. Some microorganisms are going to interrupt the metabolism. This can happen in multiple ways. Something like alcohol makes, it dries up the environment, so removes water, and water is important in metabolism. Okay, hydrolysis requires water, right? As something like the use of heat, so a oven drying out. Okay, desiccation also drying out, removal of water. That interrupts then a metabolic process, the metabolic processes for that cell. Now, recognizing factors that influence microbial death. First, we have, of course, this one thing that's going to play a role in influencing microbial death, or the ability of that antimicrobial to do its job, is the site to be treated. What is that site? Okay, is it a fomite, an inanimate object, living, or is it living tissue? Okay, because you're going to have to treat those differently. In the end, if you're trying to work with living tissue and remove microorganisms, you don't want to be destroying the living tissue in the process, right? So you're going to have to keep that into consideration in order to ensure that you are, serving the purpose and the goal that you're looking for. Temperature and pH are going to affect antimicrobials. In general, hotter temperatures make many of your antimicrobials more effective. So if you have a disinfectant that you've purchased, right, and you, most of them you buy in concentrate, if you dilute it, according to the instructions, you dilute it as you should, right, and you are diluting it with hot water, it's actually going to be more effective than if you dilute it with cold. Okay, both are going to work, but one's going to be more effective. Temperature that's important. Now pH. pH is actually, if it's going can sometimes deactivate some of, especially some of your chemicals that are out there. So if it's a very acidic or a very alkaline, if there's a lot of alkaline or acid present, that could actually inactivate certain chemicals, right? So you've diluted your disinfectant, and but then turn around and you're trying to clean a environment that you had an acid spill, right? Well, first of all, the ideal situation is get any liquid that's down or solid that's down, get that up first, and then use the chemical, okay? In the same way, and kind of linked to pH, is the presence of organic material. The presence of organic material, right, that would be vomit, feces, right? The things that, most of us are urine, the things that most of us are going, yep, we're pulling out the disinfectant, we want to clean, right? If we see it present, we want to get it removed and cleaned right away, right? But the organic material, so we want the disinfectant to work for that particular situation, but the organic material can actually deactivate some of your disinfectants. Again, this is the reason why they state, first pick up bulk, right? Then use your disinfectant. Remove the bulk first. Remove as much of the organic material first, before you try to disinfect the environment. And just to ensure that that material that's left behind isn't going to prevent that disinfection process from working. Time of exposure. Alcohol. So, okay, for a moment I was like, fire alarm, are you serious? Time of exposure. Your alcohols, they evaporate faster, right? In fact, 100% alcohol is not actually, we'll talk about this later as we hit the alcohol, but absolute alcohol, that is 100% alcohol, is less effective than 90% or even 70%. And that because it evaporates faster, right? And its mode of action is a little bit different too, by the way, and we'll get into that later. But that is important. You also, when you're looking at time of exposure, you don't want to, if in certain situations, you don't want to select, a disinfectant that's got to be exposed to, you have to have that surface exposed for half an hour for it to be effective, right? Especially if you need to be in and out in a quick time frame. Concentration, that is the dose and the intensity, and the freshness of chemicals are going to come into play. Many of your chemicals, when you go and purchase them, you'll notice they're in dark amber bottles or white bottles, right? Mostly that's because of the fact that these particular chemicals degrade in the presence of light. They break down in the presence of light. You're buying it at a concentration because they last longer at the higher concentration, but they do degrade over time, right? So you want to, when you are using a disinfectant, you want to follow the dosing. Okay, and most of us probably don't at home, right? It says, X number of milliliters in a gallon, and of course, who the heck knows what that is, and so we just pour. And, most of us don't have buckets where they have the gallon situation marked, so we start filling it up and go, oh, it looks about like a gallon, and pour in, right? Higher dosage doesn't necessarily mean more effective sometimes. Or it could mean higher dosage. It could mean that you leave a larger residue that can be harmful to animals and young children, right? Both of who are on the floor, right? More frequently, the pads of the animal, for the animals, pads of their feet. They absorb, chemicals that are on the ground. And so that'd be a way for absorption of these chemicals into the body. In the case of infants or toddlers or kids in general, because mine's still 8 and puts anything and everything in their mouth. So, hands on the floor, and then touching their mouth, sucking their fingers, and the chemicals are getting into their system. So more does not necessarily mean better, right? And then, of course, like I said, freshness of the chemicals. I don't know about you guys. And I say this each term and yet still haven't gone home and corrected it. But, I spent, some of these disinfectants, I spent a good $4 or $5 on buying this disinfectant, right? And, 5 years later, 10 years later, right? I still can find things, oh yeah, I'm sure if I go underneath this kitchen sink, there's some stuff or in my garage, there's stuff that's in there, been there for a long time, okay? Not wise to use it, which is why it's still there. But, it is important to keep in mind that many of these disinfectants do have expiration dates. So you need to make sure those are coming into, you are aware of those before you use them, so you're not using something that has expired, because now it's at a lower dosage. So even though you might be following the dose requirement, the concentration is different because of that,
I didn't
right?
even know they expired.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even know. But they don't last long.
And once you dilute it, right? Once you dilute it, you don't hold on to it. Use it and toss, right? Because you buy it in concentrate for a reason, and that is in concentrate it actually lasts longer. Once diluted, it breaks down, and also the fact that if you have it diluted, more than likely you have it exposed to the air and light, and so it's going to break down faster, right? So you shouldn't, prep and start cleaning one day and then, okay, I'll get it to the rest of it tomorrow and leave, and then come and use that same, right, dosage again. Yeah. So these are things that, you know, in a work environment, you probably don't do, but when you're at home, right, you're going, I paid way too much, I'm not tossing that, I'm going to make it last, but it doesn't, right? Your question or comment?
I was gonna ask, okay, so like Hispanics, a lot of them will use like fabuloso and then bleach and like letting out
Do a
water.
bomb.
Is that not, I guess it's safe for the ground or safe for kids? Or dogs?
Well, bleach, depending upon how much you do use of bleach, does leave residue. And I say this because back when I was the lab manager here, actually the lab room was right where this
New building is at.
no. Yeah, the room right here, the computer room right over here, you know, you go down as you exit out, there was a computer room there, that's about where the lab room is, and all the desktops were black, right? And our disinfectant that we used was 10% bleach, right? And number one, 10% bleach, over the years, you'd get pits, and just a little bit of damage, and the water soaks in, and then also you can see white film. So bleach leaves a film behind. So the long-term use of bleach actually leaves bleach film behind that yes, can, you know, your kids are, it's an acid, right? Or caustic, I know it's not an acid, but it's caustic, right? It's not the acid, it's the other. But yes, your question.
I have a question because I tend to weekly I pour out a lot of bleach, especially in the shower, in the bathroom, the toilet, and I leave for hours. It does good.
No.
Sometimes I need
In this case, again, bleach is caustic, right? So number one, I don't know if you guys know, but your tiled showers, right? That grout needs to be sealed on a regular basis, right? If you don't seal it, it can get little cracks and hairline cracks in it. And the harsher chemicals you use, the faster that sealant goes. As far as, I mean, I don't recommend those little tablets that you put in the tanks of toilets either, because the metal in the tank for the mechanism to make your toilet work is going to starts corroding faster for that whole process. So it destroys the mechanisms for the toilet that are in the tank. So, you know, with the handle is attached to a piece that controls flow in. You've got the little flapper. The flapper it's a plastic, and sitting in a caustic environment like that, over time it deteriorates. And it just deteriorates faster. So it's better to go in and just clean, flush, done. For the purposes of your, you know, the toilet itself and the mechanisms of the toilet. But bleach, I'm hoping you're not using straight bleach.
Yes, I do. I created all many different detergents, only one.
The other issue you run into is if that's the case, is the fumes are not healthy for you either. You've probably already burned all the nose hairs out of you. And don't even notice.
Yeah, I'm not kidding.
No,
I've
but they're
been
not
doing this for many
the
years.
fumes from the bleach, from straight bleach.
And
Yeah.
every day I always put bleach every single day. I had the habit to spray the toilet bowl, sink, once a day, and put bleach. I'm pretty nosy. I had that problem.
Straight bleach.
Yes, straight bleach, I'm not kidding.
Well, we have
Wow.
to stop.
I knew I feel like
That's
that's
the learning
That's
material
how
for
I
today.
feel.
Okay.
What are you supposed to use then? If you can't,
This
like,
is
wash
the
it
learning
before-
material for today's
It doesn't do
class.
anything to
Well,
it.
bleach should be
I know
used
everybody
at
else
a
is complaining, they're
dilution,
like,
first of all. Usually 5 to 10%. 10% is usually the max that you need for bleach use in household settings, or lab settings for that matter.
I put like 4
The Clorox is a diluted of
This
I used
pure
water in it.
bleach.
When my
No,
mom
no
was
bleach.
like fabuloso.
It's
or
so hard
hot
for me. I feel
water.
like it's not clean.
But I don't put a lot because I don't like the smell of it.
No, because it's not good for you either to breathe that in.
That's why I
I know,
kept,
but it's
one time I did get lightheaded because I had all of that mixed up, and I had the bathroom door closed.
This one.
And
Yes.
I had other chemicals infused
It will,
in my
yeah,
food,
right.
and I never did that.
Anyways, that's a conversation that, yeah, we have to have at a different point in time.
Sorry.
We need to adjust your cleaning habits there a little bit. Regardless, relative susceptibility to the microorganisms are also going to play a role. Okay, so I just pulled this offline, so this is not in your text, but gives you an idea of the relative susceptibility of microorganisms based upon whether they're going to die from the different detergents, right? And actually, you can see the most susceptible / less resistant or least resistant is actually your enveloped viruses. Okay, because again, as soon as and something is that envelope is gone, that virus is deactivated. It can no longer recognize its host. And guess what does this? Remove that out of that envelope. Alcohol, which is why most of your hand sanitizers have that alcohol in it. Okay, the alcohol from hand sanitizers is sufficient to remove the envelope from envelope viruses. Now, for non-envelope viruses, that's not going to be the case, right? They're going to be a little more resistant. But for envelope viruses, such as, right, the coronavirus, the flu virus, several of the ones that, you are hearing all the time about, you don't want to get in contact, well, they're envelope viruses. So again, they stress, simple steps can prevent you from prevent that transmission process. Now, as far as bacteria are concerned, gram-positive bacteria tend to be more susceptible or less resistant than gram-negative. That has to do, actually, has more to do with the outer membrane of the gram-negative bacteria and the fact that provides exclusionary aspects for many of your chemicals, right? Because the chemical has to get into the cell, right, and to be effective, and most of them do. And now with a gram-positive, they just have to get past the cell membrane, versus a gram-negative, they got to get past the outer membrane first before they even have access to the cell membrane. So that separates them out a little bit. Now, as far as most resistant, prions. Okay, and you say, well, that's a protein. Or hopefully you're saying that because we talked about it. If you didn't remember, I'll remind you, that's a protein. So you think, well, something as simple as heat should denature that, right? But in the case of the prions, they happen to be they are not susceptible necessarily to just straight heat treatment for denaturation. It's a very stable protein. So it actually requires a lot more. And I think when we talked about prions, I brought that up. Sodium hydroxide and autoclaving together, right? So something is extremely alkaline plus high temperature high temperature is what's needed to actually deactivate the prions. And again, deactivate, not kill, because proteins aren't alive. Okay? The next, though, if we look at microorganisms, the most resistant in microorganisms, actual living organisms, would be your endospores. Okay, your bacterial endospores, which means that we're looking at the bacilli, the clostridiums, right, and the spore sarcina. Those that fall in that genera are going to be very problematic. Now, mycobacterium falls under that. That has a lot to do with the mycolic acid that is present. That waxy-like substance presents a problem for many of our, your hydrophilic chemicals from having access. Okay, so it kind of creates that. Now, Pseudomonas and Staphylococcus. Yes, Staphylococcus is a gram-positive cocci. Pseudomonas is a gram-negative rod, and both of those have a lot of resistance, but that is because they've acquired it over time. Okay, these are Staphylococci and Pseudomonas are like a problem child for disinfection and processes, because they have developed resistance to many of our disinfectant chemicals. And then we've got our cis-form spores that are in there somewhere. So, you see that, it really depends upon the type of organism that we're looking at or we're expecting. We're not expecting endospores on, say, if we're cleaning off the tabletop. A disinfectant is going to be sufficient because I'm not expecting endospores to be there, right? Those endospore formers tend to be soil organisms. And we do already, as we already had talked about, like the bacilli, we tend to see them in the herding communities. So yes, we do have cows around here somewhere. There's farming community, somewhat local, right? But it's not. We're still in city. We're not looking at big herding communities here specifically, right? So bioterrorism would be your other option, which is again, not commonplace. So endospores are not like high on our list for our day-to-day cleaning in our household setting. All right, now we start moving into our third learning objective, which is actually the biggie here, because you're going to be having you classify microbial growth, the control of microbial growth methods as either physical or chemical, and we're going to run through these different ones. So this is what we're going to be talking about between today and on Monday, are all these different methods. So we'll start off with the physical methods, and in the physical methods we have heat-related, cold-related, desiccation, osmotic pressure, and lyophilization kind of grouped together, because they're all have to do with removal of water. And then radiation, filtration, and sonication are those physical methods we'll start into. And then on the chemical method side, we have the phenol and phenolics, we have the alcohols, the halogens, the peroxygens, the surfactants, heavy metals, alkali agents, and I've added enzymes in there. This enzymes is not specifically listed in your in the readings. So you're not going to find that listed in the readings, but we'll be covering a little bit about a few of the enzymes out there. Not many, actually. And the main one we cover is lysozyme, which happens to be one that we produce, right, and is found in many products when you see, enzymatic cleaner type of thing. So I wanted to throw that in there. All right. Nope, not that, just heat. Okay. All right. Heat methods. Effects of high temperatures. So heat-related methods, we're talking about higher temperatures. First of all, it denatures protein. All right. It can, because of most membranes have some mechanism to be able to stabilize the membrane as temperatures rise, but too high, it can actually, some membranes don't have the capability of being stable at very, very high temperatures, right? And so it can destabilize your cell membranes and destroy that cell wall, as well as, of course, it can disrupt the structure of your nucleic acids, specifically, and the function, specifically that base pairing that occurs. That's hydrogen bonding that's occurring. So your DNA, two strands that are base paired together, that can be denatured. Your RNA, you say, well, that's single-stranded anyway, so who cares? Well, no, not all of RNA is single-stranded. Remember, we have transfer RNA that has some base pairing to give us those hairpin loops, right? And that's important for the structure of the transfer RNA. And if that's lost, then we're looking at translation being interrupted. Okay, so both DNA replication, transcription, and translation, so not really both, that would imply two. Three different things, right, could be disrupted if you have those base pairing coming into play. Now, fortunately, we're repeating this, okay, for this. I'm going to repeat what we talked about on Monday, which is always important since we're having a quiz today. So this is like your booster again for refresher for Monday, from Mondays for today's quiz. Yes? All right. Thermal death point and thermal death time. We talked about those in the lab. All right? And we talked about an experiment, and so we're going to run through it again. The thermal death point is the lowest temperature that kills all cells in a broth in 10 minutes. Okay, so the key is 10 minutes. And by saying point, we're looking for degrees Celsius. Okay, and the time is already defined. It's defined as 10 minutes. Okay?
10 degrees Celsius?
No, 10 minutes.
What did you say Celsius for the?
Point, the term is thermal death point. So you're looking for the degrees Celsius.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought it was
The time is defined in the definition
Okay.
as 10 minutes. Okay? Thermal death time, you're looking for time. Okay? So in this case, the definition does not define the temperature. It has to be provided. So no one can give you multiple temperature results and say, tell me the thermal death time. Because you'd be going, okay, at what temperature? Because it depends upon what temperature you're looking at as to which time, okay? So we talked then on Monday about this experiment, right, where we had our hot plates at different temperatures. We put our cultures, already growing culture into the different temperatures, and then we did a control plate immediately upon putting it in. We took out a sample just to demonstrate that the organism was alive. Right, that was the purpose of the control plate, because we want to look at cell death, so we have to establish that our culture was alive to begin with, and then every 10 minutes we took out a sample. Now here we have Staphylococcus aureus and Bacillus megaterium listed, right, and our thermal in for this data, because I don't remember if it's the same data, I may have altered it some, I don't know, I can't remember, but for this data, right, the Staphylococcus aureus, the thermal death point is what? 90 degrees Celsius, because at 10 minutes, it's at 10 minutes here at 100, it's dead. Yes, but that's not the lowest temperature at 10 minutes where it's dead. The lowest temperature for Staph aureus where it's dead is 90. Okay? And then what is our thermal death time for 70 degrees Celsius? 30 minutes. Okay? So for Staphylococcus aureus at 70 degrees Celsius, when do we see death? At 30 minutes. So our thermal death time at 70 degrees Celsius for Staphylococcus aureus is 30 minutes. So this is the type of information that an experimentation that they did in order to get that time frame that is necessary for you to boil water, right, if your water system has been compromised. So oftentimes during, right around or after, say, a big storm, hurricane, etc., you might get a notification from your utility. Again, if you live in Orange County, that's my group, okay? And that boil water notice is going to say that, testing has indicated a potential problem, okay? And therefore, before you use your water from your tap, you need to boil the water for 10 minutes. Where did that information, that time of 10 minutes come into play? This type of experimentation, right, is how it was determined that the organisms of concern are going to be killed within those 10 minutes if you boil it. And of course, boiling is, at sea level, boiling is 100 degrees Celsius. All right? All right, so now, as far as heat is concerned, for heat methods, we have two types of heat methods. We have dry heat and we have moist heat. Okay, so we'll talk about dry heat first, and then we'll go to moist heat. Dry heat is used for usually used for material that cannot be sterilized with moist heat. And dry heat would be things such as ovens and Bunsen burners. Okay? This is actually a different style of a burner for the tool. So this is obviously you guys worked with in the lab, a Bunsen burner. This is a type of burner where it's you actually stick your inoculating tool inside, and it's a high heat. So instead of having a flame, the coils are in here keeping the inside of that very, very hot, so it does the same thing. Okay? So it's a tool for that same purpose. So when we're looking at in the laboratory environment, usually we're looking at incineration or use of the Bunsen burner. Okay, this of course is the ultimate means of sterilization. Okay, because you are literally incinerating whatever's present, any cellular organism or virus, down to nothing, right, to carbon. So it is the ultimate means of sterilization. It is a sterilization process. Now, ovens, though, on the other hand, are a little bit different. Ovens are, of course, here we're talking about dry heat. So ovens, first of all, easily accessible, right, for all of us, because most of us have an oven at home. Okay, and so it is a source of disinfection process that is very effective and easily accessible. It can move to a sterilization process. To be a sterilization process, you need to have the items in the oven for 170 degrees Celsius, at 170 degrees Celsius for 2 hours. Then it is a sterilization process. Okay? Now, that's going to work for tools, equipment, solid items. It is not going to work for say you're making a media. That's not going to work. A liquid media, 2 hours under that type of heat you're going to have evaporation, right? Depending upon the volume, you might not have any water left by the end of the 2 hours. You know, certainly what goes in is going to be different than what comes out, right? Just because of the loss of water. So therefore, for the use of ovens, it's not efficient for certain things, you know, that have moisture involved. Okay, but for solid, you know, inanimate objects, sure, it works. All right. Generally, of course, this, as you can see, 2 hours at 170 degrees Celsius, you're looking at a higher temperature. And as we go into moist heat, you're going to notice that ovens require a higher temperature and a longer period of time than moist heat. Moist heat is more efficient. Moist heat, though, there's different levels of moist heat. So moist heat, we can fall under different classifications. It can fall under disinfection, it can fall under sanitization, it can fall under sterilization, and then we have another that we'll talk about, a specific type of moist heat called pasteurization. Okay, so the moist heat works just like the dry heat, denatures proteins and destroys our cell membranes. It denatures nucleic acids. It is considered more effective than dry heat. Now, under moist heat, we've got boiling, autoclave, pasteurization, ultra-high temperature sterilization. Okay, so boiling, we're talking about just putting water or a liquid over heat, right? And at sea level, for boiling is going to be is only going to require 10 minutes to kill most of your pathogens. It is a disinfection, sanitization process. Okay, and of course, if you are that 100 degrees is at sea level. So if you decide to go up to, say, Virginia, go in the Shenandoah Mountains area, you're no longer at sea level. Okay, and therefore, at those levels, water boils at a lower temperature. So it's not 10 minutes. So when they get their boil water notice, it's not going to say 100 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes because water boils at a lower temperature than 100 degrees Celsius. So it's going to say that temperature and an extended time frame, okay, in order to make sure that they've killed off any organisms. okay? But we live in Florida, we're pretty much considered sea level. All right. Just as an FYI, endospores can withstand 20 hours of boiling. So when you are boiling, it again is not a sterilization process, it's a disinfection process because it does not kill endospores. To maintain 20 hours of boiling, you're going to have either a very large amount of water or have to continually be adding water, right?
Water.
Exactly, you won't have much left. But regardless, you have to, it is not considered a disinfection process. So if you want, a sterilization process, it is a disinfection process. So if you want a sterilization process, then you're looking at autoclave. The autoclave is basically pressure cooking. This autoclave is shown in the picture that's from your textbook, is actually very similar to what is in the prep room over in the lab. An autoclave works as follows. That door has a handle just like a submarine would be. You unlock it by twirling it, you can open up. Inside, there will be a little shelf or sometimes multiple shelves that you put your items onto. And then you put water at the base. Okay, the water at the base is what's going to become steam. It's going to vaporize and become steam in this locked system. So when you've got your items in there, you close up the system, twirl that hatch to make sure it is locked tight, and apply the heat. Okay, as the heat is applied, the steam that is in, so there's different mechanisms. The ones that I've worked with, the water inside is actually creating the steam. There are some that pipe in the steam. Okay, but as that water heats up and the inside, the steam increases, then what happens is in an enclosed space, that steam is going to result in increased pressure. Okay. And we need the pressure to reach 15 psi. PSI just stands for pounds per square inch. That's the pressure that has to be inside there. When at 15 psi, the temperature is going to elevate from 100, so water will move from 100 degrees Celsius for that boiling on up to 121. So for autoclave, it is 121 degrees Celsius, 15 psi. And exposure for at those conditions for 15 minutes is a sterilization process. Okay, it will kill any organisms that are inside. If you have like a lot of, like if you really loaded up the inside, sometimes they'll increase the length, or they'll go from 15 minutes maybe to half an hour. Okay, and that's just to ensure that the exposure time has been long enough for everything that's in there.
Yeah, the book says it has to be at 121 to 132, and it's for 20 minutes or more.
An autoclave is usually set at 121. Yeah, an autoclave is usually set at 121. And you do have testing that you do in order to verify this. So depending upon your facility for an autoclave, to ensure that it is working, because once you autoclave the material, the biohazard material, after that has been complete, that material can go into the regular waste disposal, okay, because everything has been killed. So facilities that use autoclaves do have to demonstrate that the autoclave is working properly. Okay, there's different ways that you can do that. And it depends upon the facility as to what the regulatory requirements are. So I don't know off the top of my head in the hospital setting. I know at my job in an environmental lab testing water, okay, for microorganisms. And that is on every single run, we have to record that the pressure that was met, the temperature was met, and the duration. Okay, so you have to record all those. In addition, you must have indicator tape on. So there is something called autoclave indicator tape. Before you autoclave, it looks like this. It looks like masking tape, okay? But after you autoclave, if the temperature and the pressure has been met, and really to get to 121, you've got to meet the pressure of 15 psi. To make that happen, to get to the 121, in that between the steam and the heat, you'll get these little black lines that show up. It's a chemical that turns black when that temperature has been met. So you'll have little diagonal black line slashes across that indicator tape. That indicates that this has been autoclaved. Most of your autoclave bags, that chemical is written, they use the chemical to write on there, okay, that it's been autoclaved or something along that lines, so that when you autoclave the bag, that biohazard bag, now when you take it out, you can now see it's black on that to indicate that it has been done. Because that is, again, that's the proof that this isn't just a bag that's been tossed. It's been a bag that first went through the autoclave process and then has been tossed. Now, that's on each and every single run. For our lab, on a monthly basis, we have to also perform another test using these little ampules that have endospores in them. And these endospores are for a bacillus who is a hyperthermophile, so likes very high temperatures, survives very, very high temperatures. And the endospores are in a media, and so you take the little ampule, you put it, and you autoclave it, and then when you take it out, you squeeze the ampule to break the media. The media is in a separate little ampule inside, and you squeeze that in order to break that inside ampule that then releases it so that it has contact with the endospore strip, okay, and you incubate it overnight. If the endospores were killed during autoclaving, which they should have been if the autoclave is working properly, then there will be no growth, and the media will stay the same color. If the organism grows because the autoclave is not working efficiently, then after incubation, the media will have changed colors to indicate that the organism is metabolizing that nutrient source, and so you're scheduling autoclave repair right away, obviously. And so in our lab, that regulation is once a month. Again, I don't know what a hospital setting has as far as their regulations, but I know we have to do, or are required to demonstrate that on a monthly basis that says, yes, not only are we looking at the tape, not only looking at the printouts from the instrument saying that everything's working good, but we also have another test, okay? Because again, the goal here is to sterilize the biohazards that we don't want being released into the environment or into having other people have access to, okay? Now, the other two are going to be talked about in the next two slides. That is pasteurization and ultra-high temperature sterilization. Pasteurization is used for milk products, ice cream, yogurt, fruit juices, honey, mostly a liquid, primarily liquid-based, okay? And it is not a sterilization process. The goal is to heat this liquid to a temperature high enough to kill the pathogenic microorganisms. Okay, but not necessarily high enough to kill all organisms. So organisms that are heat tolerant are able to survive this process. Okay. This picture over here actually comes from your textbook that's online. This I actually pulled offline because I had found it a couple years ago. I don't know how long ago already, but previous textbooks didn't actually have the picture of what a pasteurization unit looks like. So the pasteurization unit, you'll notice this, it's there, it's hard to see, it's smaller there, but if you look at this, you can see we've got this pipe work that goes back and forth, right? That's where the activity happens. Okay, so what happens is, so these are the pipe work going back and forth. What happens is your, the product, whatever it be, in this case, say milk product, the product is going to go through the pipe work at a speed at a set speed, so that liquid is going to pass through the heating section, which is going to bump up the temperature of the product to a specific temperature, okay, and then immediately cool it back down, right? Because the goal here is not to we don't want boiling, because boiling is going to destroy our milk. It's going to curdle, right? But we want to heat it high enough to address those potentially pathogenic organisms and destroy them. Okay, so there's different types of pasteurization. Batch pasteurization, which was kind of the first that was identified, it was 63 degrees Celsius, okay, for 30 minutes. So the speed that the milk product would be passing through these coils would be such that section, they would be at 63 degrees Celsius during that heating period, and they would be in that section for 30 minutes. And then they would immediately be dropped back down in the cooling section. But flash pasteurization is a newer process, relatively speaking. It's not that new, but it's the newer process where they bumped up the temperature to 72 degrees Celsius. Okay, so about 9 degrees higher. But by doing so, that drops the duration or exposure time to 15 seconds. So for 72, at the temperature of 72 degrees Celsius, it's going to pass through that region where it's going to be at 72 degrees Celsius. It's going to pass it within 15 seconds and then be brought back down to cooling. Okay. And then there's also something called an even newer one called ultra-high temperature pasteurization. In that case, they actually bring it up to 135 degrees Celsius. So past boiling, even higher than autoclaving, but they only expose it for 1 second. So the speed getting through that heated section at that high temperature is going to be, it'll only be at that 135 for 1 second before it's quickly cooled back down. But that is sufficient to kill those pathogenic microorganisms. Again, not all organisms. Heat-tolerant organisms, such as many of your lactobacilli, still survive. And we know this because when we have a milk product that we've never opened before, right, it can still spoil because of those microorganisms. Okay. Fortunately, those microorganisms fall into that group of what we call the good microorganisms that help our gut, right? That are already found in the gut anyways, and are what we refer to as probiotics. Okay. All right. And then our last under the heat-related methods, and I'll stop for today after this one, are the ultra-high temperature sterilization. Ultra-high temperature sterilization, the system is much like pasteurization. So it's those coils going, and the liquid is going to pass through those coils. But in this case, they're going to bring it up to 140 degrees Celsius for 1 to 3 seconds. Okay, and that followed by a rapid cooling, and this will kill off. In this case, this is a sterilization process. This will kill off all of those all bacteria, okay? And this allows then us to store that liquid product, such as milk, at room temperature. So no longer, regular pasteurization processes, all three of the ones I just spoke about before, once it's pasteurized, you still have to store it in the refrigerator so that those heat-tolerant organisms don't overgrow and you don't spoil that product too quickly. In the case of the ultra-high temperature sterilization, this is the stuff that you can store at room temperature. This is relatively newer, obviously. My parents, for a period of time, once my dad retired, lived on a boat, and I remember it was probably mid-90s where they were like, oh, so excited. I went to visit one day, and they're so excited because they could finally have milk, right? Because the only time they could have milk was when they were in port, because it spoils too quickly, and they don't have refrigeration. They didn't have refrigeration on their, on the boat that they were living on. So this was a big thing because then they could store it at room temperature. Now, my son loves milk, right? And I was like, oh, sure, I'll get this for him to take to lunch. Wouldn't drink it. And if you've ever tasted these, they do taste a little bit different. So the sterilization process is, unlike pasteurization where you don't change the flavor, this sterilization process does change the flavor somewhat, right? So, the addition of chocolate Like, doesn't the addition of chocolate make everything better? I mean, it's like cheese and chocolate, one or the other is always going to make things better, but helps in the covering up that slight variation in the flavor. So I was cooking with this stuff for a bit until I could get rid of it because he wouldn't touch it. But anyways, you can store it at room temperature. That's its importance, right? And for people who don't have access to refrigeration or, and electricity, that's a big deal, and they take advantage. I mean, the fact that you don't have, it tastes slightly different doesn't matter to them because they're just happy to have milk, right? And that is going to store. Yes, they do have expiration dates on them, but they are going to store. For as long as it's sealed, it is sterile. So, indefinitely, right? Really, because there's going to be no. As long as it remains sealed, there's going to be no bacterial growth in there. Interesting thought, right? I wouldn't run out and buy it though. All right, so 7:35 we'll meet in the lab. We have the quiz first, okay?